Welcome, everybody. It is SharePoint Dev Weekly, episode 36. It is now 23rd of April because today's Tuesday. Typically, we record this on Monday, but Monday was a public holiday at majority of Europe, right? Mm-hmm. At least in my location and in your locations as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, except in US. US didn't have a free time. So this time you were planning to have a joke. Sorry, Waldek.
No. I was about to say something inappropriate. No. Let's not go there. No politics. This is a politics free show.
This is politics and religion free show. Yes, indeed. We're not going to touch those topics. Now, this time we wanted to definitely have a visitor, and a long time request from many of the people who are viewing the stuff. They wanted to actually see Spence live in the show as well. Spence started SharePoint when SharePoint was still black and white. Right?
Some say.
Some say. But Spence, can you do a quick intro? Who are you and what's your background?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Spencer Harbar. I'm based in Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. And yeah, as Vesa kind of alluded to, been working with SharePoint for quite a long time now. Started way back before the product was first released with a company I was working with at the time, Development House here in Edinburgh. We were looking at some very similar things to what ended up being eventually in SharePoint Portal Server. Then I sort of switched gears a little bit and moved into the security industry for 5 years or so before going back into sort of mainstream Microsoft technology stack, and been there ever since. So yeah, mostly known, I guess, in the community for infrastructure focused topics, whether it be hybrid or some of the legacy on-prem problem areas of the product. But my background is actually as a software developer. That's how I started in the business. Well, that's not really true. I did actually start as a web page designer way back. If we go, when web pages were grey and you had one font and things like that.
When they were black and white, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or grey and white. But yeah, very quickly, moved into what we would call software development now. So it's a little bit unusual in some respects because whilst I've focused in terms of what I do publicly on the infrastructure pieces for quite a while, that background is probably the thing that made that infrastructure focus quite easy in a number of respects. Made it easier to understand some of the mysteries about what the SharePoint product's doing, behind the or under the covers. Hence some of the work that's been done on things like distributed cache and user profiles and so on and so forth. In recent times, I've kind of moved away from SharePoint and mostly focused now on Azure and obviously Office 365. But it's a pretty mixed bag really these days. Identity is still a huge challenge. I still work mostly with enterprise customers, so they tend to be bogged down in some of the governance or user adoption challenges as well, and also involved heavily in the upcoming conference in just under a month in Germany, Collab Summit. So the organization behind the scenes for that takes up a chunk of my time, or free time, outside of work, getting everything arranged. I look after the content and the speakers and all of that side of the conference. So we're, fingers crossed, touching wood that there's no disasters that befall us before the event kicks off next month.
Yeah, but that always happens, right? So you got so you have to prepare for that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's always the things you can be prepared as you like, but if something happens, you just deal with it the best you can. But yeah, minimizing it's interesting because the event has grown now to quite a significant size. That the challenges a lot of them are the same that you get at every event, but just because of the size now, there's a lot of other things that crop up that you've never really thought about before, and that's interesting to me because I was involved in the conference that happened in London every year for 5 or 6 years. I worked with Steve Smith on that, and we tried to make that conference be all of the things different. In other words, to fix all of the things we didn't like about the big conferences. But then when you actually do a big conference, you start to understand why some of the things are the way they are at the big conference that we all hate, of course.
Right.
But you know, once you actually are running one, it becomes obvious that in some cases there's no way to avoid it. You know, things that you wouldn't even consider if you're just doing a kind of a user group or a SharePoint Saturday type event. So yeah, it's from fun and games, and obviously working with, you know, Adis Hugo and Matthias Engin, those guys. You know, I mean, it's just a headache, right? I mean, you got to put up with those guys. You know, half the time you don't know what they're saying. It's just
Well, so to be fair, Waldek knows that because Waldek is reporting to Matthias. So
yes, indeed, yes, indeed, yes.
It is a small world. It is a small world. Oh, did we say it out loud? Is this we're in YouTube? Oh
no,
my
so
God!
The was bad, so I didn't hear it.
Yeah, exactly. We can do beep, 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 beep on that section. Now, a few things what you mentioned, actually. First of all, I have to say, and Waldek was saying this earlier as well, the bookshelf looks awesome. The old books on the background. And some of the old schools, in quotes, old school people can definitely recognize that style of is it Microsoft Learning books? Which used to be?
The top ones was all the kind of .NET. When .NET first came out, they did these two different kind of series, and they had these cubes, you know, on the covers. I think that was a Microsoft Press or one of those publishers. I keep meaning to sort that out and maybe move them or something, but obviously I haven't brought. Well, I don't really buy books anymore. I tend to get given, you know, copies by the authors or whatever, or if I'm reviewing them for people and stuff like that, you know. But I prefer actually having, especially when I was, you know, learning .NET. There was that whole kind of period of time, 98 through to 2001, where it was all new, and that was the only way I could really do it, was to sit down with the actual book. You know, you can't imagine doing that these days because, you know, all the information is online, or in most cases, most of the information is in a video.
True.
You know,
well, that's true as well.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so if I think back, I mean, I used to learn the same way. I would take a book, read it from back to start, and then I would
do
know
exercises.
Yeah. And I mean, I would have the feeling that gave me a thorough idea about the topic. Whereas now you read an article here, you read an article there, you kind of have the idea that you get it, you do some stuff and they work, but you don't really truly get the whole thing because it's just an article. And then to get the whole, and the great thing about a book is that it covers it from the beginning to the end, and then sometimes even really, really deep, right? And you don't get that amount of info in single place in the same cohesive way online from an article.
Yeah, if it's a good book, it'll certainly have a story, you know, it'll tell a story which helps the learning experience. And there's so much now that it's, you know, you pick things up and you can learn from an article, but you end up in most cases having to read it multiple times.
You
know, and then you forget, oh, I vaguely remember reading something about that, and then you hunt around, you try and find it, and then you stop, you know, you find it again, or you get distracted. I'd compare it to learning music. If you know, one of the ways to learn music so that you can memorize music is to continually repeat, you know, a structured learning program, and that's very similar to following coding examples in a book, because you're actually repeating certain things over and over again, and that's essential to learning, you know, in any field, but it's a particularly good sort of comparison with any kind of instrument, you know, learning an instrument.
And I guess there's also the interesting thing, because I think that or at least it seems to be that way, that for the last few years there's this big hype of you have to be on the edge. You have to use the latest, the greatest, even though you don't really understand the benefits. And there's especially from the sure, code things, it might work or not, but to really comprehend the pros and cons, the benefits, things to take into account, caveats, if any, especially when you think about scale, like you don't get it from an article. Like it takes time to crystallize all of that. And if you always chase the latest, the greatest, well, you will come across things that just don't work because nobody thought about it, or there's that hasn't been taken into account yet because the feature with which you work is an MVP basically, and it's meant to do this particular use case, and everything else isn't there yet. Where in the past, like you would read a book, by the time you got the book in your hands, the thing you read the book about was already a year old. So there was quite a few revs on that.
Yeah, it was stable. It was designed, well designed.
Yes, kind of worked. Yeah.
Well, in some cases, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Not all of them. Yeah. I think the other thing is quite important, particularly with software development considerations, is that the one thing that always being on the bleeding edge, using the latest framework, using the latest tools and techniques, and kind of dealing with the how to stay up to date and how to learn that stuff and quickly enough to get value from it. What that means is you're not, in most cases, you're not focusing on the fundamentals, design choices that have been made, to implement that new framework or whatever. And we found this with the MCM program quite often. Most of the topics that we were teaching, the specifics were important for sure, but that wasn't really what we were focusing on in terms of for the folks who weren't familiar with that. If we take transaction processing as an example, sure, you can pick and choose one of 10 frameworks to implement that, but what's important is you understand the why behind ACID. And so most of the books that we actually recommended in the SharePoint MCM were out of print. You can get them for 1 cent on Amazon, used books, right? The good book about information security or the good book about SQL Server is, long since out of print. But that's the most valuable resource to sort of backfill that computer science background part of it that we seem to be moving further away from, even though everything we're using is still built on top of those same principles.
True. Now that's an interesting, I'll go back on that one in a second. Just to clarify also, me and Spence, I got to know Spence because he was in the MCM training at Microsoft Certified for SharePoint certification program as an instructor, as I was. And what we did, I did 18 rotations, and we were apparently we always overlapped with Spence.
Yeah, we were usually on the same week, weren't we, in Redmond, and on the same days. And it got to the point where Vesa could have delivered my lectures, and I could have delivered his, and done impressions in Finglish. And
so does that mean, Spence, that at times that you would stand on a desk without shoes?
I never did any of that silliness. I mean,
he doesn't have to do tricks. His audience is watching him without gimmicks and tricks. So that's the thing.
Well, we did do brief lunchtime introductions to Scotch whiskey and things like that. So that was kind of my party feats. It's just to lighten the mood of it. We didn't do any tasting, unfortunately. That had to wait until after
of course,
it finished. But
now coming back on the serious discussion, you actually mentioned something really interesting around the backfilling of the understanding, and that's really, if you think about the current situation, we talked about this one almost every single week within the SharePoint Dev Weekly, which is kind of interesting, but it's a growing theme. Do you actually need to understand the background information or not? So, or are we already heading to the direction where it doesn't matter if you're a new person who has just graduated from university? There's no way to backfill the background knowledge. It's just impossible.
Well, yes and no. I mean, so one of the things that I think that is a typical example, especially when you think about 365, but maybe in other areas as well, is that all samples for code, like when you call from front end and API to get data. It just like sample call, single call, it works. But then you build the thing that you've built is being deployed at scale.
Yep.
And you will come across things like throttling.
Yep.
And no examples explain it because examples are simple.
Yep.
Right? And there is no logging. And at that point, it's, oh, crap, how do I go around that? How do and where do you get that info from? And then you have to understand, okay, so why is it there? How it works? How do you handle it? And so forth and so on, right? So I don't know. I think that there is like, for some things, there is still a big need to understand at least the basics, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, there's many facets to this. I mean, it's certainly true that one can be successful as a implementer of Office 365 or any other service, software as a service, without being, being able to recite computer science theories and things like that. That's certainly true. But then on as Waldek mentioned, troubleshooting, the more the easier that will be. The classic one with Office 365, of course, is page load performance. The canonical complaint that we've all heard, oh, SharePoint's slow, and then you check it and it's like, no, it's not, it's perfectly okay, or on my machine, and all that kind of stuff. And then when you start extending the solution, build on top of Office 365, so you're maybe hosting components in Azure, making use of platform as a service, then it becomes increasingly important if you want to improve in your career and you want to become more of an architect and less of an implementer.
Yep.
You're going to have to make design choices. Where is the right place for this component to live? Should it be a flow or should it be a logic app? Those kind of things. And so the more information, like with any discipline in life, the more you know about the fundamentals, the more successful you will be. Sure. As you go forward. But there are many areas where, even whilst you don't need to know the details of why these choices have been made by the vendors, information security would be the best example, it's still very important that you don't have keys in plain text in a configuration.
Yep.
And yet that's a circular thing that keeps coming back to, regardless of the tools and technologies we're using, whether it's client server and then it's web and then it's server cycle and whatever. There's always a cycle where you start seeing those in samples again. You're like, oh, hang on, So it's also a question of having that base level of quality of whatever you deliver. It doesn't sort of doesn't fall into some of those potholes that you might come across. And again, the more background you've got there, even though we might laugh and joke about that and think, well, that one's really obvious, why would anybody do that? But if you see it in a sample, the sample, it's an easy trap to fall into. So I certainly think that the programming specific and programming language specific concepts remain as important as they always are. In terms of how you design an interface, those kind of things will save you so much time. I mean, even just one of the little things that we've got on the GitHub repository for user profiles is, if we were going to do that tomorrow, we're going to start that tomorrow, the interface would be completely different to the one that we've got there. So what do we do? Do we throw it away and start again? We kind of, is the answer, but we can't because we've got people using the one
exactly.
That's yeah. So it certainly made it higher level. The abstraction layers are always increasing, but it doesn't take away that fundamental.
But now, our customers, what's your kind of a take on this one? Are customers still willing to pay for the knowledge and experience enough comparing the value what that can bring? Because more and more we are heading to this good enough IT thinking, which we, by the way, talked about in MCM, which is weird. It gets to be now visible in all around the industry where people don't really care. As long as it does, from a UI perspective, what is expected to happen, I don't care.
Yeah, partly. Yeah, well, again, it's a very kind of, there's two ends to this. There's, for the most part, the concept of kind of good enough and quick enough, the answer is no, customers are not willing to pay for that, level of quality or whatever you want to call it, because it takes too long to implement. You know, the whole benefit of software as a service, in essence, is that you can get the stuff quickly, you can try it. If you don't like it, you can throw it away and use something else, or you can, you know, wait for the next improvements, and you're on that continual cycle. But then if you start thinking about data loss of critical information, you know, data loss is not acceptable. End of conversation. So in some respects, you know, it still needs to be there. But as to whether, you know, customers are willing to pay practitioners, no. I mean, everybody wants everything faster, cheaper, quicker.
Sure.
They don't necessarily care about it being better. But then there are also some considerations to think about from a kind of adoption / governance perspective, in terms of, you know, the idea with Office 365 is that it's software as a service. You can embellish it with customizations, but you can't intrinsically change the behavior,
underlying
behavior, and that's a good thing. But you've got to convince customers that they can, that's going to be good enough for them, and then they say, oh, but we don't like that icon there. We want it 750 pixels over here.
But it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So,
or does it matter, and how much does it matter?
Yeah.
But that's yeah. So that's the interesting. It all depends discussions. And sure, from a code quality perspective and security perspective, that's what Waldek actually represents, right?
Yes.
So the people are willing to then buy ISV solutions and automations, which will double check things.
And that is an interesting thing, right? Because we talk to customers a lot, right? And at first I say, so if a person was never exposed to any issues, they're like, no, I mean, we're perfect. We don't have any issues. Until you show them, like one of the things we offer at Rancor is an assessment, basically to give them a proof, like, let us basically do an X-ray on your environment and have you see for yourself what you have. And then, like the other day, we ran an assessment of an on-premises farm for an enterprise. We found hundreds of thousands of apps, and an app being a piece of script that can be embedded on a page, to anything like bespoke app in Angular or workflow, WSP, anything, right? And they would have thousands of that on their whole environments. And the only thing they know, like, yeah, okay, so we know we had WSPs because these are deployed by admins, but everything else, like, we had no idea. And if you think about, like,
it's the script editor web part, right? The kind of a script embedding
it's
capabilities,
that custom actions, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And the interesting part is that, like, we hear a lot that they will invest in things like VPN access. When you work at home, you cannot access it. You will have RSA tokens. You'll get all kinds of things to basically give them the impression that you're safe. And then they will allow the users to embed a random piece of script from internet on their pages, which is basically already in. And that script can then do, on behalf of the person who is already on a page, anything it likes, because there's a rich API available for search, managing permissions, creating sites, and whatnot.
Yeah.
And that script is already in. Like,
sure.
Yeah, it's a classic, you know, IT industry trend, or cycle, I should say, right? Regardless of the trends in the industry, these things persist. You know, like you mentioned, virtually all organizations are still kind of handcuffed to these legacy security technologies, you know, that protect the edge of the network, or, you know, make it more difficult for people to log in, and all of these kind of things, because, you know, there's a whole bunch of IT security vendors that are selling that stuff, and they're behind. You know, there's 3 vendors basically in the business who are so far ahead of everybody else with what they're bringing to market and the pace that they're bringing them to market at, and everybody else is kind of rushing to follow up. And so you can spend all that money on, you know, TIN or, you know, 2-factor authentication, whatever it might be. But the real risk is actually in the web applications. I mean, you just look at the news every time there's a data breach, you know, oh, well, we didn't realize, you know, that it was some old database behind the scenes or whatever. And, you know, if you think about Graph API, that's an incredibly powerful capability. But if you're running that as the tenant administrator, you're going to see different results than if you run it in the context of the user. So luckily for us, or most of us in this space, Microsoft are very serious about how they provide the sandbox in which we run. And that's not always the case with all of the cloud vendors. So that gives us a certain confidence factor, but it makes running the kind of tools that you just described so important. Also think about most of the things that we build nowadays are leveraging somebody else's JavaScript framework.
Yes.
Well, what happens if there's vulnerability in Node?
Yep.
Yeah. And so on and so forth.
Now, I just had last week a discussion with one of my good friends, he's nowadays in Salesforce, but he's an ex-MCS consultant who used to work on SharePoint for years and years and years and decades. And now he's on the sales part and basically is then explaining why SharePoint is good and all of that stuff. But then it's like, well, he told me that it's a really restricting factor in the modern SharePoint that we do not allow scripts editors being embedded because that increases the costs, making everybody's life difficult, and then it's restricting what can be actually happening. So he recommended that his customers would still stay in publishing, classic publishing.
Well, until one customer or another will end up in the news, and then there will be like the huge shock. No, we have to move away from the classic because that is like a can of worms, and then we have to go to modern where you can have more control of these aspects.
But it is an interesting kind of it's an interesting dilemma for Microsoft as well, and especially for SharePoint, if you think about it, because we used to tell people that you can do whatever, and then suddenly we realized that maybe this isn't the right thing to do, and especially now that we're hosting our stuff in the SharePoint Office 365, we can't compromise the environment on the behalf of the users or the behalf of the customers. So.
But I guess for a part it also has to do with the fact that over time things change, right? If you look at like back in the days, let's say 15 years back, the only things that you could do JavaScript-wise was to show clock on a site or marquee text. Sure. Nowadays, you can perform AJAX calls to different APIs, pull in data, manipulate things. You can do so much more. But that also, on one hand, that is empowerment because you can achieve more. But on the other hand, it also exposes you to more risks because you can do more.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about Microsoft's journey in particular was for, nearly 20 years, basically Microsoft gave up, in fact, for all intents and purposes, gave up caring when the ISO was written to a CD. Now that they're in the business of actually keeping that stuff running in the data centers, they're doing the right things even the largest, biggest, securest, to use a made-up word, deployments of SharePoint on-premises historically were nowhere close to the level of robustness, etc. that the SharePoint Online is. Despite what people would say about how wonderful the systems they were, I worked on all the big deployments. They weren't that great because it's impossible, for somebody who's not willing to put, an incredible amount of resources. And, the companies running these things are not in the software business. They're in the making cars business or making, beverages business. And so that soaks up all the energy, which means there's nobody looking at the kind of things that we're talking about in that environment. Whereas with, the Microsoft services, Amazon do the same thing as well. There's a whole crew of people that have got no interest in keeping the servers running. Their only job is to keep their eye out and, monitor the security of the systems and the type of calls that are being done. Some of the most interesting work that I've been doing over the last couple of years is just on the network infrastructure, intrusion detection type activities and scripting.
Yeah.
And, the scale that that's being done at is just quite mind-boggling. But it's also very scary because as good as it is, you're thinking, well, okay, this is all the stuff that we've thought about, and we've got this whole thing over here, all the things that we haven't even considered, that we don't know about yet. And so I think that's one of the most interesting challenges going forward, balancing that versus the desire of the product groups to bring new capabilities quicker and quicker, and also have a framework or a platform that allows us as third parties to extend it and do other interesting things.
Absolutely.
tying, we used to have an idea in SharePoint on premises. It was a really bad idea of building composite applications. It would be a full trust solution. We'd have some BCS connectors. We might have some info. All that stuff, right? Well, now we've got a similar patchwork, but it's our responsibility, right?
Sure.
So if we build a Azure web job and we integrate that in some way with SharePoint Online, it's our responsibility what's happening in the web job. We're not protected there by a constraint that we have to do a class definition like this and we must implement it. So it's a great.
That's actually. That's an interesting balance, by the way.
Yeah.
That is and how the industry moves in waves as well, and then Microsoft moves in waves as well. Because sure, on the Azure side, Azure gives you a set of tools and components and all of that stuff, but then you need to worry about how do you actually implement stuff. And then the Microsoft 365 or Office 365 is more around, hey, service, and then what we do as a developers on the Microsoft 365 platform is that we take those pieces from the Azure side and we integrate stuff and we make magic happen. Maybe sometimes maybe it's magic. So
yeah, but I guess there's also another aspect to this, and I guess that with regards to time, let's try to go to the links because we can keep going on that forever. But I guess that in the past there was let's say one advantage that we had is that everything was in single place. So when things broke, there was ULS. You could get a pretty decent idea of in which place in the stack things broke. Now you have Flow that might do something in Teams through Graph. You might have something in Azure, a job. You might have function, microservices thing. Then you have front end in SPFX. And when things break, there's no unified log across all of them, at least not out of the box, right? So if you think about operating things at scale, well, you have to take that into account, right? And then the moment you reach out to anything external that is beyond the control of the IT, well, you have to take care of that as too, and who's managing that security and so on and so forth, right? So.
Oh, you mean that the governance stuff, agreeing?
No.
Yeah, that's just. Now, let's. We've been talking way too long, but that's fine. Good discussion, and hopefully the people who are watching this are agreeing on that. But let's do a few articles and then we can touch on the discussions and then come back on a close-up for this week. Now, few articles from Microsoft side. So this is from Lincoln DeMarius. Lincoln is a principal PM. Anyway, getting confused on the titles. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He's a principal program manager from our development team, well, not development team, but feature crew. And he's responsible of lists and libraries and SharePoint Online. And this relatively new stuff from last week related on document sets, which are coming now in the modern SharePoint libraries. And so if you used the document sets in the past, you were kind of redirected on the classic experience, and that wasn't an optimal situation. So finally, that's getting also modernized, so to say, which is a great thing. It's going to be a long journey. We are investing more and more on the document management side of the story overall in Microsoft 365. So the search and everything else is getting involved. So cool stuff from there.
Nice.
The second thing, what I wanted to quickly kind of pinpoint, so this is just an updated version, quick update on the provisioning service. We talked about the provisioning service quite a few times, and the Lookbook side is an awesome site for getting designs. Then the provisioning service was the one which actually you can apply these templates to any tenant, which is kind of cool. So we did a updated release on this one last week. So we modified the UI slightly, simplified things, and we addressed some of the random exceptions which are there. We will still do quite a significant updates on the provisioning model, because right now if there's, for example, a missing app catalog or something like that, we validate that after the provisioning has already started. So we don't do pre-validation. So that's the step number, let's say 5 or 3, which is coming in a few weeks, where we actually validate your environment beforehand. So that will reduce the amount of exceptions that people are actually also getting. But really cool stuff. You can easily apply cool templates to any tenant. And by the way, if you don't feel good, let's say confident about giving this application the amount of permissions, all of these templates are available in a GitHub. If you're familiar with GitHub, and you can use PnP PowerShell. So all of the templates are open source in a GitHub repository, which is pretty cool. Now, moving on things, Chris O'Brien, SPFX isolated web parts. Isolation. The right way of connecting through the backend API. And this really comes down on what actually Spence talked about as well, and the security of things. So people tend to store or forget about the access tokens and passwords and user IDs. And the isolated web part basically gives you the capabilities from an admin perspective, grant you permissions per web part.
Yeah, this is a really good example of, Azure AD app registrations, right? So we're using that infrastructure to give us the administrator control at a granular level. It's really very powerful now. An example of something that, if we go back 18 months, it wasn't that great, but now it's, really, really powerful.
And the isolated web part went GA recently, a few weeks back with the 1.8 release, and now this way, what it means is that your web part is technically executed in an iframe on a page, and that means that none of the other web parts on a page can access your secrets, which is the key way of kind of hiding or increasing the security from that perspective. This one was a really interesting concept from Stefan Bauer. Stefan had a really great idea, actually. It's a combination. Stefan is a UI designer quite often, but he's also clearly coming up with the clever ways of using SharePoint out-of-the-box capabilities. So hub sites, and what he's basically explaining here is a archive hub. So if you have let's say active projects, and then whenever the active project is no longer active, associate that to a separate hub site, which will then automatically apply the site designs and site scripts and all of that to the site. So then there's a visual indication that the site has been archived. So really cool stuff as well. And obviously, because as part of the site design appliement, you could execute complex provisioning techniques, change the web parts and extensions and all of that, or add a header, which is saying this site has been archived or something like that.
Yeah, and also other things like, for example, to call out flow, who would then call your code, who would then exclude the site from search, so that the stale content does not come back through search.
Absolutely.
For example.
Absolutely. Good example. Really good, really great idea from Stefan.
And I guess the powerful thing about it is that this site, the content is not being moved anywhere. You don't need to have it anywhere in zip. It's still in your environment. You can still access it using the same URL, the same links. All of that is still in place. But you can more clearly denote what is up to date, what is being used versus what is older and archived.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Now, moving on models. So Mark D. Anderson, information architecture in modern world, Chasm 1, managing content types. So this is more around the status related on content type hub, which isn't quite optimal from a provisioning perspective, but on the same hand, at the same time, there's no proper replacement for content type hub, right? Because content type hub doesn't require any JSON understanding, any code understanding for replicating content types across the sites in a town.
So what we have available now isn't perfect. There is no alternative. So what would you recommend if people had a requirement for something like that? you use it or not?
That's fair question. It all depends. So from my perspective, if I'm looking into, let's say, creating an enterprise information architecture, I would actually provision my content types automatically as part of the site provisioning. So I would actually spend time on making sure that that's an enterprise-ready way of doing things. Now, if it's a small company and they don't have money and resources to make that happen, then yeah.
Yeah, well, we've also kind of skipped over the important part, right? You mentioned the word requirements, and this is, it's interesting as the product is now focusing more on enterprise content management stuff. It's kind of a cycle again.
True.
It's an example of where the requirements, if they even existed previously, need to morph to fit the deployment model of the cloud. It's not appropriate to take an old-fashioned information architecture that used to work, which it probably didn't if we're honest about it. It probably had issues. Content types is a classic one, right? It's a great feature, but if you start having 50 fields, you've got a major problem. So it's got to start with the business requirements, and they've got to be fit for purpose before really making the decision on what the best way to implement them is.
True.
Because that will vary, right? Depending on, you've got to ask the question: should you use content types? First of all, you've got to start at fundamental first.
True.
Same thing, document sets, all that stuff. All the stuff that helps drive what you might call traditional document management scenarios needs to be rethought a little bit in the new world.
Absolutely. And anyway, to be fair, it's not a new world discussion to think about, excuse me, why do we have this requirement? So is it actually needed? Is it giving us additional value, or is it just providing additional complexity? So content types is a classic. Let's say if you have, if we take a short detour on this one, if you have a content types and then you have required fields and all of that on the content type, it makes people not liking to upload any files anymore on SharePoint, which means because they need to fill up the required fields, and that causing the people to actually use something else, which then is it actually worthwhile or not? So,
does it work in Teams? Does it work in Outlook? Does it, you're causing all these barriers. And then, also just on that whole kind of thing, we've gone from a slight change, in terms of recommending how you would structure your sites and site collections now, which also ties very heavily into content types, the design decisions. It's a dangerous thing to want to kind of replicate what we used to do on-prem, in this area. Because the knock-on is bigger, right? And we've got all the things we just spoke about. Does it make people less likely to use the system? Does it make it more difficult? But also, how does it impact these other things? Other applications, mobile devices, etc., etc.
Yeah.
New
which we didn't have.
Exactly. Yeah. We didn't have Power Apps, we didn't have Flow, right? That was another, that we had to buy somebody else's software to approximate that kind of thing in the past. So there's a lot more to think about here than meets the eye.
Sure. Good side discussion. Absolutely. But absolutely 100%. That's the whole point of walking through these articles. And Mark will be talking about the content types in SPC and also in ECS. So he'll be in both locations. So we'll continue that discussion definitely with Mark over there. This one was from Victor Villain, who's an MCM as well, an MCA, and what Victor Villain isn't actually, but
he doesn't have enough space there horizontally.
Exactly.
Acronyms.
But so this one is around the Microsoft Teams apps generator. So this is a Yeoman generator for Microsoft Teams apps, and really updated version around that one. So support for Microsoft Bot Framework and extensions, middleware, and Teams schema updates and all of that. When would you use this versus SharePoint Framework? The SharePoint Framework does now support Microsoft Teams tabs creation using SharePoint Framework. And then this one, well, sure, this is also for bots and other stuff as well. So
messages, so basically everything except tabs.
Yeah, basically yes. So that's kind of the positioning around this one. And Victor is working together with Teams development team on making sure that this is up to date, so which is really cool. So now this one was from Serge Luca, related to Microsoft Flow and document sets while waiting for modernization. Well, the modernization news is on that tab over
announced,
there.
Yes. Yeah, but I mean, it is announced, right? So it is not available yet. It's coming.
Right. So, and this one he looks really young, by the way, on this one.
Yeah. Interesting picture.
Sorry, Serge, if you're watching this. He's 25, actually. He just looks old. No, that didn't sound right either. Anyway, So this is really around the fact that how you can execute flow then from the kind of classic experience, or how do you combine the document sets and the classic experience of document sets with flow and getting into approvals and everything else included in there. So super cool stuff. So Serge is really a specialist on the flow behavior as well. Used to be a SharePoint guy, and now he went more on flow. What's happening? Everybody's leaving. No. This one was from Shawa. How to add Google Tag Manager globally to SharePoint Online? This is a good reminder. Sure, do you want to use Google Tag Manager, and what's the implications of that? That's debatable. But again, using the application customizer and then using the tenant automatic tenant deployment, you can, just by adding the solution to the app catalog, you can actually get the extension available automatically across all of the sites. So if you're using the tenant-wide extension, that's both horrifying but highly convenient, because at the moment of the solution getting deployed, the code is now on every single site. It is actually at the moment. So you need to aware what you're actually deploying together with that setting.
And also another thing to keep in mind is that this is going only to work on a modern site. So if you have a classic site, that extension will not be available there, because extensions only work on modern.
Why would you use classic sites?
Some say it's document sets today.
Fair point. This one was from Hugo Bernier, really cool blog post, a really long one related on converting SPFX web part from JavaScript to React. So basically having a non-React web part converted to a React implementation. So you can take advantage of Office UI Fabric React and all of the other things from that side. And this is together with Eric Cox. And the article is like
detailed.
It's detailed entry and explanation on how these things can actually happen. And I think here we go. Now that's where it actually can be done. So, but apparently there was a few detours as well, so all good. So. But it's not necessarily as complex as the length of the article might think, right? Waldek, you've done a few transformations from the classic JavaScript to React-based components, right?
Yeah, and I guess that it all comes down to, well, what do you use, right? If you own all of the code yourself, it might be easier than, for example, if you use a plugin that works in a specific way and which you might need to retrofit to fit in SPFX and the way it works with external scripts. Yeah. But I mean, it depends. It is the classic answer to everything that we do anyway. So
we're in IT business. It depends.
Yes, everything depends. Yes.
And this one was from David Ramalho, activate SharePoint Global Search on a hub site. So again, this is one of those discussions, but it's script, it's PowerShell, is it coding? Basically, what he's doing here is that he's updating the search scope on the sites, which is one of the new features which released part of the season release in March, which then had a blog post actually, or announcement last week, I think, from one of the PMs in the feature crew. Just a reminder that search scope setting is now out, and you're able to then adjust the target of the default search box in a site level based on the search scope property. Yeah. Not on a tenant level. It's something which can be controlled right now on a site level or in a web level, whatever we call this, sites web.
SP web, right? It still makes the most sense.
For developers, yes. Developers, yes.
Well, for the admins too. I mean, if you work in PowerShell, it's still called web.
That's fair point. Fair point. Now, and this one, just a final point from Pram Dejager. Absolutely awesome, brilliant tool. He's been building this tool for quite a few years, but it's a great tool for accessing site collection and sites and lists and libraries and item and properties, because it exposes all of the different properties and settings what these objects have. So if you quickly need to have a look on, hey, so what's the column value of the modern page on this particular site, you can go and check it out really easily by using this tool. So awesome stuff. Really great stuff. And this has been like available for years, but it keeps on evolving that. And now apparently there's modern site support and OneDrive business site support. So really, really cool stuff.
Cool.
Yeah, must-have toolkit.
Absolutely. Cool. That's all of the articles. So let me quick back and remove the sharing. This discussion is probably breaking the records for the how long we're chatting. Well, I don't know necessarily.
Let's just upload it.
Yeah, that was kind of given whenever you invite Spence on a discussion, right?
No. Now you're being rude, right?
But well, I know Spence for such a long time, so we can just go on and on.
But isn't it like if you encode it to MP4, it's gonna take less time?
It's double the speed, so everybody.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Have a helium balloon.
Yes. We can easily make that happen. That's not a problem. Anyway, just out of curiosity, before we close, what are you, Waldek, planning to do on this week? Any specific things on your mind? What are you working on?
Oh, so there are plans and there are things that will hopefully take place until the end of the week. So the plan currently is to release a new version of the tool that we have available at Rancor, the Health Check, which allows you to quickly scan a number of sites, and we extend it to Flow and Power Apps, basically to help you to understand quickly, is there anything in my environment that requires immediate attention?
Yeah.
Anything from vulnerable scripts to things like one of the things that we see a lot is, for example, people will implement the whole OAuth flow in flows. Like they will store client ID secret in plain text in Flow, which like in a way is like, yeah, if you only allow admin to access that, it's perfectly fine. But then what if you export that flow and share it with somebody else and you didn't think twice? Credentials are in plain text in there. And these are typically admin level credentials, right? Because they would be admin kind of flow. Like, no, right? So
and again, the same discussion. Again.
Exactly, right? Yes, exactly. So we hope that we'll be able to simplify discovering them and then making people or raising awareness of what kind of things are in your environment, right? So we hope that will be available in the coming days. And then there are some other things related to company management and all the things that I am involved with. So I'm going to spend some time on that as well, and also working on the CLI, new versions available, new commands adding to that as well.
Makes sense. What about Spence? Anything what you can tell?
Yeah, I've got some sort of mixed bag this week. I've got some customer work, which I can't go into. Doing a webinar on Thursday, which is around sort of business adoption challenges, or it's kind of C-level discussion. And
where can we find more information on that?
If you go to my company's website, so www.clearpeople.com, and there'll be a link to the event section on that site.
And obviously, this was Thursday on 25th of April, 2019. Yes, so if you're watching this video 2 years from now, it's
you've missed it.
Yeah. But the recording is available on the web, perhaps.
Yes.
And doing some prep for some updates to the PowerShell stuff that's up on GitHub, which will be released at the Collab Summit conference. So that's sort of happening in the background if time allows this week. So yeah, that's me. Fairly busy this week with the Monday bank holiday.
And that reminded me, yes, the Monday isn't helping at all. Losing one day is horrible. Oh no, well, one extra day with family wasn't that horrible. But anyway, that reminded me, we actually released a new GitHub repo. I haven't actually done any announcements yet. We'll figure it out, and I need to share with you on that one.
Here first.
You heard it here first. SB admin scripts is out. Actually came from the OneDrive side because OneDrive had requirements for sharing admin scripts. Okay. And it's like, well, why wouldn't we actually have SharePoint/SB admin scripts as well? And where we can actually start.
DSP.
Well, no, it's one GitHub OneDrive and then GitHub SharePoint. But anyway, so that's a new repo which I set up earlier this week, actually on Sunday. I might have actually worked on Sunday, but hey, but I need to sync with you, Spence, on that one. Okay. So the direction on the things, definitely. But
and these are admin scripts for PowerShell that work only on Windows, right?
Well,
Just
that's
checking.
a fair point. That's a fair point. We're not explicitly calling it out. Are they PowerShell scripts or not? So sure, why not actually also have CLI scripts there? Because I don't see, if it's a script which works, it's a script which works. So as long as there's guidance steps on what are the requirements,
Prerequisites, yeah,
that's it.
cool.
So, but now that I remember that, and we got that one recorded as well, I will need to sync with you, Spence, on that one.
Yeah,
at some
drop
point.
me, drop me an invite for when it works.
Yep. But that's one thing what I've been doing, and there's quite a few things on my endless list of post-it notes on my table, which nobody is able to see. I can actually show here. Here's my archive.
Oh, there you go.
Your archive. So this is your hub, your hub archive.
That's actually all his passwords.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
I mean, it's simple, right? Vesa rocks with a 0.
Yeah.
Sure.
How hard can it be, right?
How can you read from there? I think that's it for now.
Well, so actually, the camera on iPad is on, so it just scans through.
But I think that's it for this one. Thank you, Spence, for joining us. Good chat as always. It's good to have the long-term experience and good to have your experience and discussions on many of the topics as well. And thank you, Waldek, for joining once again. And we'll come up with a new SharePoint Dev Weekly in a week or so. But stopping the recording. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.